Hello everyone, welcome into today's virtual coffee break with CLF, the Conservation Law Foundation. I'm your host, Tyler Pybron. I'll be walking you through the program today. We've got a great one lined up as well. As always, they're always great ones, aren't they? Today it's all about transportation solutions throughout New England. Now, while some form of public transportation exists in many seasons in towns throughout New England, it's really often inadequate, honestly, which also burdens our low-income and communities of color, barring access to jobs, healthcare, school, recreation, and a plethora of other things as well. Meanwhile, states are struggling to keep up with the cost of funding public transit and maintenance for our bridges, highways, and other forms of public transportation as a whole. Now, it's time for a major shift in the way we think about transportation. So joining us to discuss these issues and a whole lot more, we are going to be welcoming in Staci Rubin, Senior Attorney at Conservation Law Foundation, Arnold Mikolo, Environmental Justice Advocate at CLF, and Neenah Estrella-Luna, Social Equity Consultant at Star Luna Consulting. Now, before we get started, as always, we'll have a few housekeeping notes that I want to kind of dive into. So we want to take your questions. We want this to be an open kind of conversation and dialogue with you in the audience. So if you do have questions, ask them. You can do it a few different ways. If you're on our website, go ahead and put it in the chat box directly next to the video player itself. You might have just enter your name and ask away. We'll be taking those questions a little bit later on in the program itself after we get through some of the presentations. But we love it when you ask during the course of the show itself. That way we can have those ready to go when it's time for the Q&A. Now that's on the website. If you're on Facebook, you can do that really the way you would comment on any Facebook video out there, just below, or if you're blowing the screen up to the full extent, you could obviously ask to the right of the video player as well. I know Facebook has changed a little bit since the last time we've done one of these, but that is how you can go ahead and chime in and be a part of the discussion. But if you do have any issues, you can always reach out to our events manager, Katie Ardrey, who's standing by to take care of all your questions, walk you through any issues whatsoever. So you can reach out by emailing at kardrey@clf.org. So that's KARDREY@CLF.org. Now, Katie is awesome. We love her. She'll take care of everything for you and walk through it all. Now, as we turn to our first guest, Staci Rubin, who will discuss the current state of transportation throughout New England and give examples of recent successes in Massachusetts. So without further ado, Staci, I will hand things over to you and take it away.
Thank you so much, Tyler. Good morning. I am so glad that you joined us on today's coffee break to hear more about our transportation work. CLF's transportation advocates work to combat climate change and improve access to healthy and safe multimodal transportation while eliminating greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution. We work to overcome historic disinvestment and structural inequality. We work to improve public health and social mobility. Everyone, no matter their race, age, physical ability, or income, should be able to move freely between the places we live, learn, work, worship, and play, knowing that our transportation service is efficient, reliable, and affordable. Such a system, one that people can rely on, that can get cars off the road and cut pollution, are not the ones we have in New England today. And we're talking about transportation work today. Our work really does address the climate crisis by focusing on reducing air pollution and climate damaging pollution while achieving transportation justice. We want to ensure that people of color, low-income residents, and others can get where they need to go. Today is the perfect day for this conversation for two reasons. First, I prefer to talk about transportation justice every single day, and it's always Transportation Justice Day. Second, today is the 125th anniversary of the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Plessy versus Ferguson. This is an infamous decision that created post-Civil War amendments that marked the formal beginning of an era of legalized discrimination on the basis of race. For those of you who don't know, and that's okay if there are many, Plessy was a case that was challenging a law requiring segregated rail cars in Louisiana. The Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of laws requiring segregation and legitimizing the Jim Crow laws and policies all across the United States. These laws would not begin to be overturned until the 1950s with the Brown versus Board decision and many others. Our work today continues to dismantle that legal discrimination. All right, so back to what we're talking about. Transforming our transportation systems. How do we do that? Well, you'll see in this image here that we're centering racial justice and community-based partnerships. We're advocating for clean transportation policies that eliminate tailpipe pollution and improve the ability for people to get around. So for example, in Massachusetts, how are we transforming transportation? We're pushing for a low-income transit fare, and we were successful in getting a new law passed just this January that decriminalizes transit fare evasion. It is not surprising to me at all that we have data showing that the majority of people who were cited and arrested for not paying their transit fares were Black males. We're also pushing for New England states to offer incentive programs that allow all people, especially including low-income residents, to purchase or lease a new or used electric vehicle. We're working in New Hampshire and Massachusetts to get utility rates that make it easy and affordable to charge electric vehicles at times that are good for our electric grid. In Massachusetts and Rhode Island, we're working on legislation that will establish deadlines to convert our polluting transportation fleets, like buses and freight trucks, so that we transition from fossil fuels to electric vehicles. In all 6 states, we're working to improve air quality in air pollution hotspots. I want to talk today about 2 specific locations that are air pollution hotspots and the work that we, along with our partners, are doing to improve air quality and prioritize transportation options for communities of color and low-income communities. So first, I want to talk about our work to expand transit justice by improving train access in Massachusetts. We are proud members of the Fairmount Indigo Transit Coalition that has been working for years to expand train service for the benefit of communities of color and low-income residents in the neighborhoods of Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, and Hyde Park. These are neighborhoods in Boston. CLF helped to secure several new train stations over the past decade and succeeded more recently in getting 8 new trips added to the schedule each day to increase the frequency of train service the past year. We're now advocating to get rid of the diesel-powered trains on the Fairmount commuter rail line and bring in new electric trains that will significantly improve air quality. The image is a map of the city of Boston asthma cases. This map shows the areas of dark purple, which are the communities that have the highest asthma prevalence compared to the light pink or the light purple or pink color. In the center of the dark purple is the Fairmount Line commuter rail train that travels through these neighborhoods with the high percentages of people of color and low-income riders. Our work to increase the frequency and affordability of train service will cause people to choose to ride the train instead of hopping in a car. Our work to get electric trains will improve air quality and improve health for nearby residents. The map we just showed should look very different 10 years from now once we get those electric trains and get more people to choose trains over cars. My second example is a region involving the neighborhoods of Chelsea and Somerville, Massachusetts. These are other areas with air pollution hotspots. Many years ago, in the 1990s, my predecessors at CLF challenged the building of the Big Dig project, which put highways and underground tunnels to make room for green space and safer local streets. One condition of that Big Dig project involved creating high occupancy vehicle lanes along I-93, the main north-south highway that traverses through the city of Boston. You see here an image of what I-93 typically looks like. So that left picture with congested cars on the roads is what it looks like on most days. There is a 2.6-mile stretch of highway that has operated as a high occupancy vehicle lane since the 1990s. And this lane creates an incentive for people to carpool or to take the bus. That HOV lane was intended to reduce air pollution and improve the speed for bus riders and people traveling with 2 or more people in a car. We learned about 2 years ago, in May 2019, that the Massachusetts Department of Transportation sent out a notice on Twitter that they were eliminating the lane for 2 years. We were concerned about the impacts of that tweet, and we connected with our community partners. We partnered with several community groups. We learned that the decision to eliminate HOV lane was due to work happening on a different highway in Chelsea, Route 1. We determined that eliminating that HOV lane violated the Clean Air Act. The simple resolution was to get the state of Massachusetts to just reinstate the HOV lane. While that was important to us, there were other important community goals, such as reducing air pollution, creating faster bus trips, and reducing noise for people living next to highways. We partnered with Green Routes, the Chelsea Transportation Task Force, the Welcome Project, and Somerville Transportation Equity Partnership in order to figure out what the community wanted and to address the fact that we had two impacts to highways that were prioritizing single drivers from wealthy white communities and burdening people of color, lower income people in Chelsea. All right, so what did we do with the HOV lane? Well, we had a great victory in the fall of 2020. We were able to leverage a violation of the US Clean Air Act and really achieve community goals. So not only were we able to reinstate that HOV lane in November of last year, but we were able to get 2 new bus lane pilots on major highways, the first that we've seen in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We knew that the elimination of that HOV lane caused increased pollution and slower bus trips for people who chose to take the bus. Now we've got one currently operating bus lane on the Tobin Bridge that shortens trips for bus riders from Chelsea and Boston. And we have a new bus lane that should start benefiting riders from the Merrimack Valley in a couple of weeks. This victory involved meetings with communities and decision makers, bringing them all to the table at the same time, something that's rare in the transportation landscape. And lastly, we were able to leverage this Clean Air Act victory to get an analysis of what other managed lane options are available in the Commonwealth and how to ensure that we use an equity lens and have leaders from our environmental justice communities at the forefront. These 2 examples demonstrate our work to transform transportation systems and create better options and experiences for train and bus riders like you and me. I am privileged to work at CLF and contribute to bettering our transportation systems. I will turn it back to Tyler to introduce our next speaker, who will give other examples of our transportation campaigns in New Hampshire. Tyler, back to you.
Awesome. Staci, thank you so much. I love that. And especially, growing up in the state, you watch it, and it's really interesting to see everything that you guys are doing. I really appreciate the work. And that was just fabulous. I loved it. So as you mentioned, we are going to turn our focus to our second speaker, Arnold Mikolo, who will be taking us through a case study on transportation systems in Manchester, New Hampshire. So without further ado, Arnold, I will hand things over to you. Oh, and I think, Arnold, you might be muted right now, so we'll just make sure that you unmute your microphone and we should be good to go. No problem.
Thank you very much, Tyler. Thank you very much for having me, and welcome to the coffee break. We'll be talking about transportation, and I'll specifically focus on the environmental justice aspect of transportation as it relates to Manchester, New Hampshire. My name is Arnold Mikolo, and I'm the environmental justice advocate, resident of Manchester, New Hampshire. I'm sure you've all heard, show me a friend and I'll tell you your future. But what you probably never heard is, show me your neighborhood and I'll tell you your future. This is true when it comes to transportation. People of color and less affluent neighborhoods oftentimes carry the burden of environmental injustice. More affluent neighborhoods are positioned to have the environmental justice benefits, and unfortunately, low-income folks do not have those privileges. I'm going to show you a graphic of survey that we did recently, just asking the community what are some of their needs. And as you can see, concern about fast traffic was second, just right after hunger and food security. I'm going to show you a picture of just how 2 neighborhoods living in the same street could be totally different from a transportation issue. One of the issues that we've been focusing on is neighborhood highway. As you can see, this is a street in Manchester named Maple Street. Some of you may know about this street. This is a 1-lane street, but has double-lane streets. It's a one-way street that has double-lane streets. And as you can see, two vehicles can travel in the same direction at the same time. And this is just a group of us, the biking for equity, just biking around town and enjoying a beautiful weekend. But what you can see here is that any of us at any second could have easily get hit by a car if a vehicle wasn't paying attention or if one of us hasn't paying attention. In contrast, I'm going to show you another neighborhood, same living on the same street. This is the same street, but just across from a street that separates them, Bridge Street. Two different zip code and two different outcome. As you can see, they have a bike lane. It's all safe for family to ride their bicycles, but also you see that it's now a one-lane street. So how do we end up here? The street that you see has a lot of green space, and as you can see, it's an affluent street and also an affluent neighborhood. They have the means to advocate for themselves. They have the means to call their representative and talk about issues that are affecting them. In return, representatives listen to them and actually execute it. Most of the city budgets are allocated to make sure that these neighborhoods are safer, but also family friendly. But unfortunately, the low income neighborhoods are not getting the same side of the bargain. As environmental justice advocates, my role is to come in and connect with with communities by building trust and relationship, identify some of the issues that are affecting these communities, and that's through surveys, but also through conversation. And then we educate by learning more, go deeper, but also design a solution to show what's possible. Because for most of these neighborhoods, that's what's normal, having a two-lane street. Unfortunately, that's not normal because as we saw in the pictures, neighborhoods, affluent neighborhood only have one lane and a bike lane. What do? We advocate by identifying champions, partners, and allies to build a community of advocates who are passionate about building and improving their community. And then we take action by mapping out a blueprint and then finding out what are some of the opportunities, but also some of the challenges, and also kind of think and predict some of the potential outcomes and the time frame, as well as amplifying messages through media and also holding representative accountable. The most exciting part about my work is to see an outcome. The most challenging about my work is how long it takes to see this outcome. Unfortunately, through education, empowerment, and advocacy, we give our neighbors in our communities to know how to speak out and advocate for themselves about these issues that are affecting their communities, but also they're affecting their health. It's not coincidence that south of Maple, which is the more a diverse community and also low-income neighborhoods, really are being affected. They are less likely to see a primary care provider. They are more likely to be smokers or come from a family of smokers. They're less likely to be physically active. And those are just the few neighborhood indicators. But what I didn't mention is that 1 out of 5 folks who live in those communities do not own a vehicle. So how most of folks in those communities do not own a vehicle, and yet they live on one of the busiest streets. In fact, it's so busy that it's mimicked the highway, and therefore the name neighborhood highways. We need to do something about this. And the way we can do about this is to change policy. Policies that are meant to advantage one community and disadvantage the other one, intentionally or unintentionally. We need to hold elected officials accountable. We need to make sure that our communities know their rights, but also they have the same advantage as those affluent neighborhoods. We are working in collaboration with other community partners as well as other elected officials. And the goal is to make sure that the same environmental justice advantage that are being offered in an affluent neighborhood is also being offered in a less affluent neighborhood. we have a lot of work to do, but we are very hopeful that with all your help, but also with the community help, we'll get the outcome that we so deserve and so looking for. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it back to Tyler.
Excellent, Arnold. Thank you so much. Impressed obviously as always with the work that you're advocating for, but also impressed, I just have to throw out there, the ability to ride and film at the exact same time. That's never easy, to be completely honest with you. So that was great addition to the show. So really appreciate that. So we'll bring Arnold back into the fold a little bit later when it comes time for question and answers. And I want to remind everybody out there that is in fact watching right now. I see a few questions out there from Bobby and from Brad mentioning just a few different questions. We'll bring those up again later on in the show. If you have one, enter it into the chat box. If you're on our website, go ahead and do so right on the chat box directly to the right of the video player itself. And again, if you're watching on Facebook, you could do it the same way you would any video on Facebook right now. So we'll be taking those questions in just a little bit. But before we do that, we have one more speaker that we want to get to. And to introduce her, I'm going to welcome Staci Rubin back into the fold. So Staci, go ahead right ahead.
Thank you, Tyler. CLF has been working to improve regional transportation access and influence transportation policies in the 6 New England states. We're working to ensure that there's a disproportionately large amount of financial and other transportation resources that benefit communities who have been burdened by transportation and energy systems for generations. The 3 southern New England states signed an agreement to join the Transportation and Climate Initiative and committed to investing a minimum portion of program proceeds to improve air quality and mobility options in overburdened and underserved communities. We also anticipate that federal funds will soon be available for transportation projects under the Biden-Harris administration, and that a minimum % of those funds will be available for environmental justice populations. CLF, along with several community partners, asked our research team to help us identify which communities are overburdened and underserved in all 6 New England states so that we can contribute to the discussions about which communities would most benefit from transportation investment. Our research team is comprised of Dr. Neenah Estrella-Luna from Star Luna Consulting and Dr. Marcos Luna, professor at Salem State University. We are working to finalize the report and associated materials in the coming weeks. I am pleased to introduce one half of our Transportation Investment Study research team, my friend, Dr. Neenah Estrella-Luna. Neenah will describe a few of the forthcoming study findings. Take it away, Neenah.
Thank you, Staci. I'm really happy to be here today. So is my cat Starbucks, so he might have some comments at some point in the next few minutes as well. Dr. Luna and I really appreciated this opportunity to do work with CLF. This was an opportunity, I mean, we've been working with CLF for a while, but this was a really great opportunity to look at the entire region as well as each state individually. The study that will be released next month confirms some things that we expected and won't surprise any of us. But it also revealed a few new things to us that I think researchers and policymakers focused on environmental injustice need to pay more attention to. What we were aiming to do in this report was to provide guidance on where and to whom transportation or climate-related investments should be directed. As we all know, we need to be ready when pots of money become available, and that's what we aim to provide data for in this report. So we looked at almost 20 different variables across 4 different areas of interest and up to 12 different population characteristics across New England. So it's a lot, and I'm not going to go into the details of all of it. There are 2 things that I want to highlight today. So the first has to do with how we define environmental justice communities. Since the 1980s, race and income have been the primary factors of vulnerability that EJ researchers looked at. And when I say race specifically, the focus was on Blacks and African Americans. And that made sense, given that most of the environmental injustices that we live with today are the legacies of centuries of white supremacy and classist forms of social oppression. It also makes sense given the history of the EJ movement. Over time, how we define race has expanded to include non-Black communities of color, but race and ethnicity, as well as economic class, have remained the primary variables that researchers look at. So this project gave us the opportunity to explore other measures of vulnerability. So for example, we looked at disability, and we also looked at access to personal vehicles because we wanted to see what the landscape of vulnerability specific to transportation looks like where car dependency might be an issue. And that's particularly the case in rural parts of New England. But here is the really interesting thing. Across New England and in every state in the region, across all of the areas that we looked at, limited English speakers were always one of the top groups most at risk or most burdened. They showed up when we looked at different measures individually and when we looked at who was the most burdened cumulatively. And they showed up even in the northern New England states where limited English speakers are a much smaller proportion of the population. And again, if they weren't in the top 3, they would be in the top 5. This is important from both a research and policy perspective. Researchers have not really had the habit of including language isolation as a factor when documenting or studying environmental injustice, and this is particularly the case with researchers who work east of the Mississippi River. Similarly, only one state in New England has included language isolation in how it defines an environmental justice population. So we obviously think that this should change both in scholarship and in public policy. We need to pay more attention than we historically have to language isolation when we study or create public policy to address transportation inequities or climate injustices. Now, there's one more really interesting finding that I want to share with you. One of the things that we looked at was transportation cost burden. So what this measures is the percent of a household's income that is spent on transportation costs. And that could be buying or leasing a car, as well as all the costs of owning a car, as well as the cost of using public transportation. What we found, we really weren't expecting. Every state and every one of our populations of concern in New England has transportation cost burdens that are above the national average. These cost burdens are particularly high in northern New England, but it's in Maine where these burdens are the most acute. In Maine, on average, moderate income households are spending 31% of their income on transportation costs. This is almost twice the national average. And huge chunks of the state are paying upwards of 45% of their income on transportation alone. Every single star that you see on this map is a census tract where transportation cost burdens are greater than housing cost burdens. And here's the other thing. The measure for transportation cost burdens that we used was for moderate income households. For low income households, these burdens would be much higher. Now, it's also true that researchers and policy people, we sometimes forget that behind all of the numbers are people trying to be healthy, trying to be safe, trying to live lives of dignity. So in the course of doing this research, I also read several studies on what it means to try to live particularly in rural places without a personal vehicle. And there were a number of things that are worth understanding about the lived experience of these high transportation cost burdens. There are a lot of people who live in rural areas of New England because they cannot afford to live in the cities. And at the same time, they cannot afford to own a car. And so they live without adequate access to medical care, to mental health supports, to education that they want, or to jobs. Imagine trying to do grocery shopping for your family when a bus that is more than a mile from your home comes every 45 or every 90 minutes. Imagine trying to do that with children in the winter, in a New England winter. Imagine the anxiety of worrying that your ride might forget to come pick you up and take you home after your doctor's appointment. These are the realities that people who carry high transportation cost burdens live with. So I would say one takeaway for me from this study is affirming that when we define who is included as a community of concern in public policy, when we decide where to extend public resources, we are defining who matters. So thank you again for this opportunity. I'm going to hand it back to Tyler. I'm really looking forward to the questions from our audience.
Awesome. Excellent. Thank you so much, Neenah. And we didn't see any appearances from Starbucks, but there's still a little bit of time, so we shall see. So, yes, I want to invite everybody out there to go ahead and chime in. I see the questions coming in, which is wonderful. Again, in order to do that, I mentioned a few times, but I always love to reiterate it. Go ahead and enter it directly on the webpage itself. So if you're on our website, clf.org, you can go ahead and enter the question directly to the to the right of, it's reversed for me, that's why. But to the right of the video player itself, enter your name and then go ahead and enter your question itself. And then as well on Facebook, you enter those questions the exact same way you would enter those questions for any video or any post out there on Facebook. So keep those coming in, but we're going to go ahead and get to those right now. It seems like we've got a few for each one of you, but the very first question, number one, that comes to is, can you speak more to how we can solve the transportation problem across New England? Now, that is a very broad, loaded question for sure, but Staci, I'll bring you back first and foremost to kind of tackling that, and obviously everybody can chime in as well, and we'll go through several others. But Staci, I'll hand that one to you first.
I'm happy to jump in first. I will say that anybody who wants to get the long answer to this question, let's talk offline. I'm always happy to talk about this issue, but I'll give you the short answer today. So there are numerous solutions that we, along with our partners, have developed. So first, we want to prioritize improving air quality in air pollution hotspots around highways, airports, and other marine locations. So one way we can do that is to prioritize operation of electric school and transit buses and electric trains, particularly on routes that are either serving or traveling through environmental justice communities. Not only do we need electrified transit, but we just need expanded transit options to reach more places throughout New England. Every single one of those improvements to transit must be paired with affordable fares. Second, we need to move forward with electrifying our fleets, our trucks, our delivery vans, our freight carriers. We need to ensure that those trips that primarily are traveling through communities that are, again, adjacent to busy roadways, we need to make sure we're electrifying, because most people are not going to be able to buy their own electric vehicle. And third, we need specific improvements for rural communities. So we need to be strengthening complete streets requirements and adding money for that to happen. We need to enhance the planning tools that include public transit, as well as, creating a volunteer driver system for people to have transit on demand, to basically say, I want to go somewhere, I don't have a fixed route transit service, I'd like you to help me get from, point A to point B. And lastly, we need to be expanding broadband access. There are so many rural communities that don't have access to the internet and also cell phone service that make it really difficult for them to do pretty simple tasks electronically or even a telehealth visit, and instead would require them to jump in a car and have a fairly long 5 to 10 mile trip unnecessarily. And I'll also just see if any of our other panelists want to add anything.
I would add, as a researcher, I would add one thing, and that is data equity. One of the biggest challenges with just identifying where we might want to direct resources in order to address environmental injustice, especially racial injustice, is that we don't always collect the data in the way that we need to in order to show where those communities are and how they're affected. So data equity is a really, really important issue, that from a policy and from a research perspective. As an anti-racism consultant and advocate, at the root cause of all of this is white supremacy and racial capitalism. And so dismantling all the things that need to be done to dismantle white supremacy and racial capitalism are the things that we need to be doing in order to bend that arc towards justice a little bit more acutely than it is now.
Arnold, I'll give you a chance as well. Yeah.
So accessibility is definitely key. And expanding the hours of transportation. In Manchester, there are certain time where transportation stops. I believe that's between 6 and 7 p.m. When you're looking at your average families, they mostly likely they work a third shift. So that limits the time they can go to work, to and from work, especially if they cannot afford Uber or Lyft. But also the other one is to make it green, which means that the ridership fee would actually be lower, and that would actually give more access to low income folks. And last but not least is to have representation, especially where budgeting is being made and where funding is being allocated. Because when you have specific neighborhood that has representations, obviously everyone wants to see their neighborhood be improved. However, those who are not part of the conversation, those who are not don't have a seat at the table, oftentimes they're left out of the conversation, and oftentimes they're not getting the appropriate allocated funds to improve the transportation within their neighborhood.
We talk
Back to
about
Taylor.
Open conversation and open dialogue. We welcome folks that are just joining us now. I'm seeing that the numbers continue to go up throughout the course of the show with folks joining, so really appreciate and welcome you in. It's been a fabulous conversation to this point, and we'll welcome you in to join in as well. So we have some more questions, several more questions that have come in within just the last couple of minutes. This next one comes from Brad. And Brad, I'm going to direct this one to Staci as well, because talking about Chelsea, and anyone that's been on the 111 from Chelsea to Haymarket knows exactly just how crowded it can be. Staci, has there been any discussions about adding a bike PED path to the Tobin itself?
Absolutely. So that is a great question. Thank you, Brad. There have been lots of discussions and actually some studies looking at improving pedestrian access as well as bicycle access to the Tobin. The study that was most recently completed suggested that it actually was not going to be safe to add a bike path or a pedestrian path on the Tobin. Really, I think the main solution that we're working on is improving the Route 111. So any of you who've been on that bus have experienced the feeling of just feeling like a sardine, totally packed in, and it's not the most dignified experience, to say the least. So we continue to advocate for more frequent service on the 111, along with our partners and really in support of our leaders in Chelsea, Massachusetts, and certainly working to improve pedestrian and bike access throughout Chelsea, and ensuring that people who want to be able to, carry their bikes from Chelsea into Boston are able to get those bikes on trains or get safe routes that they can travel, so that we know that everybody's safe and maximizing the ability for people to get around on the mode that they choose.
Excellent. Love it. I'm going to jump into the next question from Bobby, and this one's open, so whoever wants to answer this, go right ahead. But this one from Bobby, specifically about CLF. So what is CLF doing in Maine to support current legislation LD 991, feasibility study of electric passenger train from Portland to Lewiston, Auburn? So again, what is CLF doing in Maine to support current legislation LD 991, feasibility study of electric passenger train from Portland to Lewiston, Auburn? And that question came in from Bobby. So not 100% sure. I know, Maine from your study is obviously, Neenah, kind of your area of expertise, but I will leave this one open to everybody as well.
To me, that's a Staci question.
Yeah. I'm happy to jump in and just say, we're certainly supportive of expanded rail options and train service connecting different communities. We know that Lewiston is a community with lots of environmental justice populations that we want to make sure have access to transportation systems and options that work for them. One consideration we have when we evaluate legislation is not only ensuring that there's expanded access, but we also want to make sure that there's an affordability component to it. So we want to make sure that if we're expanding access to trains, that there's stops and a schedule and frequency that make it doable and reliable for people to take that train, and that it's affordable enough that people can actually benefit from that access.
We've got more questions kind of pouring through, which is just wonderful to see. So again, thank you to everybody that's participating in this. The next question comes from Jack. So Jack, that's a little bit more overarching. So how will sea level rise and other problems created by climate change be taken into account in future transportation creation and planning? Really, really interesting question. So I'll kind of hand this over to the group, and I'm sure this is one that I think everybody can chime in on as well.
Well, I think there's the question of how, and then there's a question that should, right? And I think it's obvious that we should be taking into climate change into account. And sadly, actually, a lot of things are in development right now that are not. Even when laws have been passed or, commitments have been made to consider climate change or to take climate change seriously, it's not filtering down to the construction and development, both on the transportation side as well as on housing and business and other types of development. So we looked at that actually both for CLF and in other settings, and there's two issues around the transportation that really need to be taken into account. There is protecting our roadways, particularly roadways that are evacuation routes. And actually, one of the things that I find very interesting that we learned is there's a lot of evacuation routes that are also going to be flooded. So, and there's nothing being done to protect them. The other climate change issue that we have to take account of in New England is that it isn't just sea level rise that's the issue. It's also the inland flooding. We are going to get more precipitation with climate change. We are already getting more precipitation. It's not necessarily going to come in the form of snow like we're used to, but we're going to get a lot more water in a region that already has a lot of water. So the inland flooding, both that affects rural areas as well as urban areas, is another issue that needs to be taken into account when it comes to transportation planning.
I think that was a fantastic answer, Neenah. I agree. I will add that some, basic solutions are, again, it's not a question of should we take these issues into account. It's we must, and how do we do it? So adding bus shelters, for people who are waiting for a school bus and transit buses, we really need that. We need to make sure that people are protected from the heat, from the sun while they're waiting. We need to make sure that people with mobility devices are able to access and benefit from those bus shelters. So that's certainly something that can be done. And then for every new transportation project, whether it's expanding train service or doing construction on a highway, we absolutely need to be taking into consideration sea level rise, inland flooding, and other sorts of issues, and baking that into the planning process. Any project that's receiving federal or state funds should really be required to consider climate change mitigation and adaptation. We also have many laws that we can point to, that we continue to point to say the legal structure is there. We now need the financial resources to help us do it.
Excellent. Now, the next two questions, in order to make sure we get all the questions in, because they're coming in, which is awesome to see, but we want to make sure we get to as many as humanly possible. So I'm going to kind of combine the next two in a row because they're both fairly similar, but I'm going to read one and then the other. So this next one comes in from Pam, and Pam asks, in regards to rural areas, what are some solutions to high transit costs in rural areas? Again, this one from Pam. And the next question actually came in from Carol. How do we address lowering emissions in rural communities? So those are two questions fairly similar, but obviously very, very different. And Arnold, I wanted to hear your voice again, so I wanted to bring you back into the fold. Kind of your thoughts.
Well, I don't live in a rural area, and unfortunately, I don't have a lot of experience living in a rural area. But there is a cost associated to improve quality of transportation, and that's the first thing that needs to be considered is safety of families, but also safety of pedestrian. To me, in my experience, is that adding bike lane could definitely reduce not only a lot of accidents, but also it could improve the quality of life, but also the health of communities and families, especially children during vacations who are, tending to stay inside and just watching televisions. Parents to be more comfortable letting them out and actually riding their bicycle. So the cost to, a better quality of transportation is to take into consideration that, by adding bike lane, you're reducing traffic, but also you're reducing accidents, but also not just focusing on one neighborhood and trying to see more like the whole city or the whole community. at least from my experience.
Mm-hmm.
And Staci, I can see you look like you're ready to jump in, so go right ahead.
Sure. I think that one solutions to the high transit cost in rural communities has to deal with how federal funds are allocated. So there's a long history in the United States of federal dollars being disproportionately given for highway projects, whether that's highway expansion or road paving or things of that nature. And we need to make sure that we're calling on different ways of allocating those federal funds. We need to make sure more of that money is specifically available to increase affordability in rural communities, as well as in suburban and urban communities as well. But certainly there's a need to prioritize more transit funds for affordability as compared to highways. And then in terms of lowering emissions in low-income communities and also rural neighborhoods, we need to be transitioning those freight vehicles to from fossil fuels to electrified vehicles. We need incentive programs that will help make that happen. And it's sort of a whatever works approach. So we need to make sure that there are incentives for people to lease and purchase electric vehicles if they're able to do so, with higher incentives for the low-income residents in particular. And we also need to not forget about the freight vehicles, which so often are polluting our communities from Connecticut all the way up to Maine.
Excellent.
I would agree with everything that everyone has said. I would add just a couple more things. Kind of going back to a point Staci made earlier, reducing the need for transit is also an area to look at. So, and that requires broadband access. So, and that's for both education as well as access to medical care. So our rural areas, we basically need to do something like we did in the 30s around early 20th century around rural electrification. We need to do the exact same thing with broadband. So, and that would at least start to reduce the need for people for potentially unnecessary car trips. The other thing, again, we just need more money. We need more money put into various transit systems. And one of the ways that states, especially in the northern New England states, have tried to do this is by relying on these sort of public-private initiatives. So you have something like what happened in Presque Isle, where there was a great public-private initiative that brought a bus into the town. But when the pandemic started, this very successful bus route ended up getting closed down. And it was because the economy, tanked. And when the private sector tanks and the public sector isn't willing or able to take up the slack, then everybody, and most particularly the most vulnerable community residents, suffer. So we need to basically increase tax revenue in order to reinvest those dollars into these public resources.
And I worked up in Presque Isle for a number of years and still very close with a lot of folks up there. And that was definitely the conversation for the last several months, honestly. So nail on the head right there. So I wanted to move on. We've got at least one, maybe two. We'll try to get to them if we can, questions wise, because I know we're short on time now. But this one actually came in from Facebook. So Joseph came in from Facebook. And Joseph, thanks so much for joining us. So he says, is electrification regionally appropriate for New England, considering the steep loss in efficiency during cold weather? Again, is electrification regionally appropriate for New England, considering the steep loss in efficiency during cold weather? Staci, I'll hand that to you, and obviously folks can jump in as well. And we're tight on time, so we'll keep the answers a little tight.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tyler and Joseph. Electrification is appropriate for New England. Technology has improved so rapidly, even just in the last couple of years. We've seen that we know that there are certain types of electric vehicles that work better for cold climates than others. And certainly, I think part of what we need to be doing is thinking about how do we have our electric charging infrastructure in places that can maximize the efficiency and affordability to have those electric vehicles. So technology is improving. We're working with labor partners and utilities and others to try to figure out what are the best solutions. And we're excited to figure out how to overcome any challenges so that we can make this happen.
Yeah, to me, the answer to this question is not is it appropriate? We figured out how to deal with our cold weather here in New England. They figured out how to deal with even colder weather in places like Minnesota. So, and they have electric vehicles in Minnesota and electrified distributed systems there as well, and in other parts of the world that are even colder than we are here. So it's not, to me, the question is not, is it appropriate? It is, are we committed to doing this? Are we committed to protecting our most vulnerable residents? And then once we say yes to that, then it's only a matter of how do we make it happen?
Awesome. I love it. And we keep getting great comments coming in. So I want to let folks know to go ahead and dive into these comments. Keep them coming even if the show ends, but I do have one more. So for the folks out back, I'm going to just jump ahead to question number 9. We've got a bunch of other great ones that have come through, but I have one more. This is the last question I want to go ahead and get to. This one. So, I think it may have jumped ahead. So the order may have changed. So this one, we'll answer this a little bit later, but it's actually question number 8 now. So this one's Staci from Pallavi. Could you talk about working with EJ communities that don't have organizations already representing them to partner with CLF?
Great question. So where there are not organized groups that are in environmental justice communities, we are looking at all sort of options to make that happen. So in fact, Arnold, who we hired, is CLF's first environmental justice organizer and is trying to and succeeding tremendously in getting residents together to talk about what are issues of concern to them. And we're considering how do we work either in partnership with supporting that community-led power elsewhere, whether it's working with municipal elected or appointed officials or expanding our organizing network. But it's certainly something to do. And CLF is absolutely committed to supporting environmental justice communities throughout the New England states.
Excellent. Well, guys, I honestly can't say thank you enough to Staci, Neenah, Arnold for taking time out of your day to walk through this wonderful presentation. Have a cup of coffee together. Appreciate that very much. Thank you all so very much for jumping in and part of the conversation. And for the folks that were watching and tuned in, we can't say thank you enough for taking time out today to kind of sit down with us and have, such an important conversation, because it really is just that. And obviously a special thanks to all the folks that are working tirelessly out back, kind of putting together this entire show. So obviously, without you, this wouldn't be possible. So thanks to everybody else out there. And the conversation, as I mentioned, does not stop here. So we'd love it, obviously, if you continue to have this discussion. Follow us on social media or sign up for our e-newsletter at clf.org/action-center. So make sure, chime in, be part of the conversation, be part of the solution, and that'll do it for us. We'll see you next time. Have a good one.